The vote was 17 minutes away, and the Galactic Assembly had already started celebrating. They had voted to sever Terran space from the lattice. The paperwork sat on every delegate's induction desk, glowing soft green, waiting for the final chime that would make exile permanent. In the third row, a minor delegate from the Omicro's dust lanes watched her translation node flicker amber for half a second, then snap back to green. She did not mention it. No one noticed. The chamber hummed with self-satisfied energy, thousands of species represented in a single Dyson sphere hub, and the mammals from the rim were about to be erased from every trade route, every diplomatic channel, every map. The air in the chamber tasted of filtered ozone and the faint copper tang of recycled atmosphere, the same air that had been breathed by 10,000 delegates from 3,000 worlds, and none of them smelled the danger walking through their door. No fleets, no declarations, no mercy. The basalt reliquary weighed more than it should have. Envoy Corin Vance felt the rough edges bite into his palm as he walked the prismatic corridor toward the luminous assembly, and he counted the seconds in the rhythm of his thumb tapping against his index finger. 1 tap, 2, 3. He was calculating collateral damage, same as he had for 12 years as Arch-Herald. The austerity mantle woven with Terran carbon weave caught the fractured light and threw it back in dull, stubborn shards. A primitive stone box dragged into a hall of absolute light. The corridor stretched for half a kilometer, lined with observation panels that showed the captive star burning in its cage, and Vance did not look at it. He had seen stars before. He had seen them die before. 3 hours earlier, the corridor had been empty. Now it was full of sound. Synth chimes demanded compliance from every species who entered, a tone that meant obey without question. Lesser delegates lowered their eyes as Vance passed. A pair of crystalline envoys from the glinting march folded their refractive limbs and stepped aside, their body language screaming confusion at a mammal who did not know his place. Grav wardens moved to intercept him, their hover discs humming at the boundaries of polite distance, and he walked through them like they were furniture. He had bypassed the registry. He had ignored the summons. He carried a rock into the most secure room in the universe, and somewhere behind him, a minor bureaucrat fainted at the sheer audacity of it. The sound of her body hitting the polished floor was swallowed by the chimes. The part that still keeps them up at night, that comes later. Stay close. The chamber opened like a mouth. Core Station 9 had been built to intimidate, a diplomatic hub wrapped around a captive star, and the luminous assembly filled its upper hemisphere with tiered desks, induction glass, and the soft green glow of 1,000 approval runes. The desks rose in concentric rings, each ring smaller than the last, climbing toward a ceiling that was not a ceiling but a live feed of the star's surface, coronal loops dancing in silent violence. Prime Adjudicator Krail sat on his grav pedestal at the center, 4 multi-jointed upper limbs folded beneath draped synth silks that did nothing to soften the towering insected frame. His mandibles clicked in steady rhythm, a sound like dry branches breaking, and when he saw Vance, the rhythm stuttered. Just once. Then resumed. The silk draped over his left forelimb had slipped again, exposing the chitinous joint beneath, and Vance noted it. Krail was nervous. Krail had been nervous for 2 stellar cycles, and had not known why. "You are not on the docket, Arch-Herald." Krail's voice came through the translation mesh as layered baritone, each word spaced like a verdict. "The grav wardens will escort you to the observation tier." Vance stopped at the edge of the central dais. He did not look at the wardens. He placed the basalt reliquary on the induction glass, and the glass hummed beneath the stone, confused by its density. The sound was wrong. Stone should not sing to glass. Terra intercepted the severing edict 2 stellar cycles before this assembly even convened. The murmur that followed was small. A few delegates shifted. Most did not understand the weight of it yet, but Krail's upper right limb twitched, the silk sliding off one joint, and Vance saw the calculation happen behind those faceted eyes. 2 stellar cycles. The mammals had known. They had prepared. They had walked in anyway. A delegate from the gas giant moons of Verith leaned toward his neighbor and whispered something that the translation mesh caught and killed before it reached the open air. The neighbor did not respond. She was watching Vance's hand, the one that had stopped tapping. That is a procedural irregularity. Crail's mandibles clicked faster now. Erratically, the stress signature Vance had studied in briefing files. The sound had changed pitch higher, the acoustic signature of a creature who had built his identity on control and was watching it leak through a crack he could not locate. It does not invalidate the motion. Terran space will be severed. The vote is 17 minutes from ratification. Vance smiled. It was not a diplomat's smile. It was the smile of a man who had already won, who was simply deciding how much damage to let the other side do to itself before he ended the game. His thumb tapped once against his index finger, twice, then stopped. The silence of that stopped thumb was louder than the synth chimes had been. Terra offers no apologies, prime adjudicator, only a demonstration. He tapped the reliquary, once. The ceiling of the luminous assembly went dark. Not dim, dark. Every synth chime cut out, every green rune flickered, and for one heartbeat the chamber held its breath in absolute silence. The captive star's image died overhead, replaced by nothing, and in that nothing the delegates heard their own breathing, their own circulatory systems, the small wet sounds of bodies that had never been designed to process fear. Then the projection flooded upward, a star chart so vast it swallowed the tiered desks, the delegates, the dead ceiling, the captive star itself. Azure lines connected 400 waypoints across the Morvath expanse, the Omicros dust lanes, the border sectors where extinction events had been swallowed whole by the dark. A delegate from the outer rim stood, her carapace flushing pale with shock. Her limbs, too many of them, gripped the edge of her desk with a force that cracked the induction glass. The Void Blight, that is the Void Blight zone. We lost 17 colonies there. There was no warning, no trace. They were simply gone. Her voice cracked through the mesh as a wail, and Vance heard the translation struggle with grief in a species that did not admit to grief. Vance did not look at her. He watched Crail. They came, they struck, they vanished. No lights in the warning arrays, no ships on the long-range scopes, no bodies in the dust. The triad hung in the air, 3 short beats of plain words, and the chamber absorbed them like blows. The star chart rotated. New waypoints lit. The Omicros dust lanes, where the crystalline plague had killed 40 million in 9 days before it stopped. The waypoints were not random. They formed a pattern, a web, a net that had been cast across the rim and had caught things the assembly had never known were falling. A quiet delegate in the third row, the same one whose node had flickered amber, made a sound like air escaping a sealed hull. She did not stand. She barely moved. But her hands, if they could be called hands, closed into fists so tight that the joints cracked, a sound like small bones breaking, and Vance heard it. He heard everything in this chamber now. He had been listening for 2 stellar cycles. "Charity," Crail said, and his voice had changed. The baritone was still there, but the spacing had collapsed, words running together like a man speaking too fast to think. "You hoard military assets. You let civilizations burn so you could play savior. This is not diplomacy, Arch-Herald. This is occupation dressed in rescue colors." The accusation was a lifeline, and Crail threw it to the chamber like a drowning man throws a rope. Around him, approval runes began to glow brighter, delegates leaning toward the interpretation that the mammals were conquerors pretending to be heroes, because that story they understood. That story had a place for them. The accusation hung in the air. Around the chamber, approval runes began to glow brighter, delegates leaning toward Crail's interpretation, because it was easier than the alternative. A soft-skinned delegate from the core world stood, his voice trembling with the performative outrage of a man who had never been threatened. "You admit to military presence in sovereign space. This is a declaration of war, hidden behind humanitarian pretense." The chamber rumbled with agreement. 1,000 species finding their courage in the belief that the human had confessed to something they could punish. Vance let them lean. He let the silence stretch until the climate system strained under the projection's heat load, and a thin sulfur tang of recycled coolant drifted through the tiered rows. The smell was sharp, acidic. The scent of machinery pushed past its limits, and Vance breathed it in. He knew this smell. He had smelled it on ships that had burned in the dark, on stations that had died with their lights still on the breath of crews who had spent 2 stellar cycles swallowing shadows, so that chambers like this could hum with self-satisfied energy. Then he adjusted his mantle. A small tug at the hem, barely worth noting, the kind of gesture a man made when he was about to say something he had already rehearsed 1,000 times. The carbon weave caught the light from the azure projection, and for a moment the black fabric looked like it was burning with blue fire. "You thought us loud and naive." Vance's voice was quiet. In a chamber built for 10,000, quiet was a weapon. "You never noticed the shadows we swallowed on your borders." He did not raise his hand. He did not gesture to the projection. He simply stood, and the projection began to change, as if it had been waiting for his permission, as if it had always been his. The projection changed. It happened fast. One moment the azure map showed rescue routes, supply corridors, the quiet infrastructure of a species that had spent 2 stellar cycles cleaning up messes the assembly had been too slow to see. The next moment the color inverted, azure to amber. Every single waypoint locked onto a core planetary grid, and the amber lines did not connect rescue posts. They connected kill switches. The transition was not gradual. It was a switch thrown, a breath held, a heart stopped, and the waypoints that had been markers of salvation became crosshairs, targets, the end of everything. Delegate screamed. The sound cut off not because she stopped, but because the chamber's audio system died. Every translation node went black. Every synth chime fell silent. The climate system died with the audio, and the air began to still, the circulation fans winding down, the temperature already rising from the heat of 10,000 bodies and one burning projection. In the third row, the Omicro's delegate looked at her own node, dead as obsidian, and then she looked at Vance with something that was not fear. It was recognition. It was the look of a person who had been waiting for a ghost to appear and had finally seen him in the light. "The 400 sleeper buoys weren't just observation posts," Vance said, and his voice was the only sound in the universe. The words did not echo. There was nothing left to echo. They were localized EMP network killers, built to blind, built to silence, built to wait. The triad was not rhetoric. It was a specification. It was a blueprint for the end of a civilization, delivered in the same tone a mechanic might use to describe an engine. He rested his hand flat against the rough stone of the reliquary. The stone was warm now, warm from his palm, warm from the induction glass beneath it, warm from the thing inside that had no name but function. The hairline fracture in the glass beneath the stone had spread, a web of cracks reaching toward the edge of the dais, and Vance did not look at it. He looked at Crail. He looked at the Omicro's delegate. He looked at the 1,000 delegates who had been 3 minutes from erasing his species from every map, and he held their gaze with the same analytical calm he had used to calculate the void blight casualty projections. "If you sever us from the light," he said, "we will simply pull the plug on your civilization. 400 dead man switches, waiting for my silence." The ambient hum of the great citadel seemed to vanish entirely, swallowed by the weight of a single human hand. The audio system died, and the scream died with it. For 1 second, the luminous assembly held its breath in a silence so complete that Vance heard the induction glass beneath the reliquary crack in a single hairline fracture, spreading outward from the stone like a slow-motion star. Then the projection changed. The star chart had shown rescue routes in azure, the quiet lines of a species that cleaned up messes no one else had seen. Now the color inverted, azure to amber. Every waypoint that had marked a saved colony now locked onto a core planetary grid, and the amber did not mean help. It meant target. The delegates who had leaned toward Crail's accusation froze mid-lean, their carapaces and soft-skinned faces caught in the amber glow like insects in sap. a delegate from the gas giant moons of Varith, the same one who had whispered to his neighbor, now gripped his desk with limbs that had gone rigid, his refractive skin pulsing panic colors that the dead translation mesh could no longer interpret. Vance did not move his hand. It stayed flat against the basalt, warm still, and the switch beneath his palm was not a trigger. It was an absence, a silence waiting to happen. "The vote is in 17 minutes, he said. His voice was the only sound in the chamber, and it did not rise. It simply filled the space that the dead audio had left behind. "I suggest you use them well." Krail's mandibles had stopped clicking. They were locked, not in anger, in the rigid paralysis of a creature who had built his entire existence on computational supremacy, on hive mind speed, on the absolute certainty that no single mammal could outthink a network of 10,000 linked intelligences. His grav pedestal drifted lower, uncommanded, a centimeter, then two, and the synth silks that had been draped to soften his frame now hung like dead things from joints that had gone slack. The silk that had slipped from his left forelimb now pooled around the joint, a soft collapse that mirrored the collapse happening behind his faceted eyes. A chitinous synapse underling in the seventh tier tried to transmit a warning. His translation node was dead black, same as every node in the chamber, same as the climate systems and the synth chimes and the emergency beacons that should have been screaming by now. He opened his mouth, or what passed for a mouth, and no sound came out. The network was already compromised. It had been compromised for 2 stellar cycles, and no one had checked. The underling's upper limbs spasmed, a reflexive gesture of a creature who had never before been unable to speak, and Vance watched the panic spread through the synapse ranks like a wave through shallow water. Vance watched the underling's panic with the same analytical calm he had used to calculate the void blight casualty projections. Thumb against index finger, 1 tap, 2, then stillness, the most dangerous kind of still. "You thought us loud and naive." He said it again, not for emphasis, but because the first time had been a statement. This time it was a verdict. "You never noticed the shadows we swallowed on your borders." In the third row, the Omicro's delegate stood. She had not spoken during the entire proceeding. Her node had flickered amber in the first moments of the session, a wrong detail no one had marked, and now it sat dead as obsidian on her desk, same as all the others. But she stood, and her voice, when it came, was flat. Not angry, not afraid. The flatness of a person who had lived with a question for 9 days and 40 million deaths and was about to hear the answer. "The crystalline plague killed 40 million of my people in 9 days. She did not look at Krail. She looked at Vance, and her hands, if they could be called hands, opened from the fists they had made when the star chart first turned. "Human ships were sighted in our system 3 weeks before it stopped. We reported them as invaders. The assembly logged the complaint and did nothing. We thought you were scouting for conquest." The silence that followed was different from the technical silence of the dead audio. It was the silence of a room full of beings who had just realized that every charity they had dismissed as weakness might have been something else entirely. Something they had not been smart enough to name. A delegate from the outer rim, the same one who had screamed at the void blight revelation, now sat with her carapace flushed dark, a color that meant shame in her species, and she did not look at Vance. She looked at her own hands, at the limbs that had gripped her desk in outrage, and she understood that the mammals had been in her space long before she had known to fear them. Vance met the Omicro's delegate's gaze. He did not smile. He did not nod. He simply held it, and in that look was the weight of 2 stellar cycles of invisible labor, of ships that crossed dark space without announcement, of crews that died without medals, of a species that had learned to swallow shadows because the light had never been kind to them. The temperature in the chamber had risen, the climate systems dead, and sweat beaded on Vance's forehead, a small human detail that no one noticed because they were all watching his hand. "We were not invading," he said. "We were holding the line, and we are still holding it. 400 points of contact, 400 dead man switches. If my heart stops, if my voice stops, if this stone leaves my hand for more than 90 seconds, the grid goes dark. Not human space. Your space. All of it. Every trade route. Every military channel. Every life support system on every world that depends on assembly infrastructure. He let that sit. He let them feel the shape of it, the way a man might let a fish feel the hook before he pulled. Krail tried to speak. His mandibles unlocked with a dry click that sounded like a bone breaking, and the words came out in the wrong order, the translation mesh struggling with syntax that had never been designed for surrender. This is not diplomacy. This is terror. The assembly does not negotiate under threat. Vance tilted his head. It was a small movement, almost polite, the gesture of a man who had been asked a question he had already answered. You severed us first. We simply built a door in the wall you did not know we were behind. The projection pulsed, not a change in data, a heartbeat. The amber waypoints throbbed in unison, a rhythm that matched nothing in the chamber except perhaps the blood moving through Vance's own veins, and every delegate who watched understood without being told that they were looking at a network that was alive. That was waiting. That was patient in the way only predators and humans could be patient. The pulse was slow, deliberate, a countdown measured in the biology of a single man, and the delegates could see the sweat on Vance's face, could see the strain of holding a galaxy in his palm, and they understood that he had been holding it for longer than they had known. Krail adjusted his synth silks. It was a small gesture, barely worth noting, the kind a bureaucrat made when his uniform had shifted during a long session, but his upper limbs shook as he did it, and the silk caught on one joint and tore. He did not notice. He was staring at the amber grid, and for the first time in his tenure as prime adjudicator, his zero peripheral vision felt like a blessing. He could not see the full scope of what surrounded him. He could only see the part that was directly ahead, and that part was a human hand on a stone box, holding the plug of an entire civilization. If you sever us, Vance said, and his voice did not rise, did not fall, did not carry any music that might have been called rhetoric. It was plain words in plain order, and that was what made them cut. If you cut the light, if you erase our name. He paused. The heartbeat in the projection pulsed again. The induction glass beneath the reliquary cracked further, the hairline fracture becoming a web, and Vance did not look down. The cracks reached the edge of the dais and stopped, as if the stone itself commanded them, as if the box was heavier than the glass could bear. 400 dead man switches, he said, waiting for my silence. The climax was not a shout, it was not an explosion. It was the absence of both, a quiet so deep that the delegates could hear their own circulatory systems, the small wet sounds of bodies that had never been designed to process this kind of fear. Vance's hand stayed on the stone. The stone stayed warm. The grid stayed amber, and in that stillness the galaxy changed. Krail's upper limbs sagged. The grav pedestal settled to the floor with a soft hiss of displaced air, and the prime adjudicator of the chitinous synapse, the most powerful bureaucratic entity in the known universe, did not speak. He did not vote. He simply stopped. His mandibles locked again, but this time the lock was permanent, the rigid posture of a creature who had been checkmated in a game he had not known he was playing, and the synth silks that had been meant to soften his image now pooled around his base like shed skin. One by one, the glowing approval runes on the delegates' desks flipped to the negation color, not because they voted, not because they debated, because the alternative was a silence that would swallow every light they had ever built, and they knew, with the certainty of beings who had just felt the edge of extinction, that the human in the center of their chamber was not bluffing. He had already done the math. He had already counted the collateral. His thumb had stopped tapping because there was nothing left to calculate. The Omicro's delegate sat down. Her node flickered, just once. A single pulse of amber in a field of dead black, and then it went live again, not with assembly channels, but with a single coordinate that meant nothing to her until she cross-referenced it with her own star charts. Human space. A system she had never visited. A door that had just opened, or perhaps had been open all along, and she had simply been too afraid to walk through. Vance lifted his hand from the reliquary. The stone sat on the cracked induction glass, empty now, meaningless in any conventional sense, and yet heavier than it had been when he carried it in. The heaviest object in the galaxy, holding nothing but a switch that had already been thrown. Within an hour, Terran space was granted permanent inner circle transit vectors. There was no ceremony, no announcement scrolled across the assembly feeds. The system simply rewrote itself, the way a body heals around a wound it cannot afford to acknowledge, and the mammals from the rim who had been 3 minutes from erasure became the mammals who held the plug. Vance walked away. His boots made a sound on the induction glass that was not loud, but in the silence of the chamber it was the only sound, and every delegate who heard it understood that they were listening to a new kind of gravity. No escort followed him. No Gravwarden dared touch his shoulder. The prismatic corridors of Core Station 9 threw the same fractured light they had always thrown, but now the carbon weave of his austerity mantle did not catch it in dull shards. It simply passed through, and Vance walked through the light the way he had walked through the Wardens, like they were furniture in a house that had changed owners without anyone noticing the deed. Behind him, the basalt reliquary waited on the central dais. A delegate from the outer rim, the same one whose node had flickered amber at the start of the session, rose from her desk and took 3 steps toward it. She reached. Her hand, if it could be called a hand, hovered over the rough stone for a moment that felt longer than the vote had taken. Then she stopped. She withdrew. She returned to her desk, and her node showed a single incoming message that she did not open, and the chamber hummed with a new kind of silence. The stone sat, the chamber sat, the galaxy sat. And somewhere in the dark, beyond the Dyson Sphere panels, 400 sleeper buoys kept their watch, their lights off, their hearts beating in amber rhythm, waiting for a hand that had already walked away.